Well, hello, dear ones, and welcome to the Center for Contemporary Mysticism, both here in Philadelphia and those of you who are joining us at home. It's always nice to gather again with our spiritual family, come together in this sort of unusual time in which we're living. It feels very nice to come together with a spiritual family, I think, and find that sacred space in which we can take safe harbor in God's love. Let's start by a moment of centering silence. I'd like to make the space we have together, both here and those of you at home, you're part of this sacred space. So let's start with a moment of centering silence. Get comfortable if you would. Notice your breathing. Take in a few deep breaths and exhale them slowly. If you wish, place your hand over your heart. I invite you to say a little prayer to God or Holy Spirit or Divine Mother or the universe and ask them to be present with us today, to sanctify our time together, that it may bear the fruits of healing and compassion in a world so desperately in need of healing and compassion. Amen. Well, thank you. And today is a special time. We welcome back Eileen Flanagan, who was with us about 5 years ago. And she's gone on and done lots of interesting things in the past 5 years. And today she's one of the leaders in the spiritually grounded activism movement and has written another book that she'll be talking about today. And so in addition to catching us up with what she's been doing in the past 5 years, she'll introduce us to her new book called Common Ground. And I haven't had time to read it all. I've looked at it, but I intend to read it. And it really talks about the ways in which we live kind of in an illusion of separation, with the fallacy that living, in the world we have that's kind of dying in many ways, that somehow we can live and thrive and be healthy in this sort of world. And that's just not the case. And so in a way, that is bringing us back to take a look at our illusion of separation, and she's going to talk about that from her book and her work. So for those in person, we invite you to make use of our snacks, and if you need the restrooms, you go back toward the front entrance in the other hallway, you'll see it. And so also, those of you at home, get comfortable, and everybody here and at home, turn off your cell phones so it doesn't interrupt our sacred space that we're creating. And lastly, I'll mention particularly those at home that our live stream will have the chat feature enabled. And so if you need to comment throughout our time together, you can do that. And particularly when we get to Q&A, and at times that Eileen will give you a notion of having some feedback, be sure and use the chat feature in our live stream. So without further ado, help me welcome Eileen back to the center. Welcome.
Oh, it worked, yay. It's great to be with you again. I like to start, because I'm an organizer as well as an author, I like to start with a little community building. And so I'm going to give you an icebreaker. And we already heard a little bit. The subtitle of this book is kind of a mouthful. The title is Common Ground, but the subtitle is How the Crisis of the Earth is Saving Us from Our Illusion of Separation. And so here's your icebreaker. What do you think that phrase means, or what does it evoke for you, the illusion of separation? And there's no one right answer. Lots of things emerged as I was doing the research for this book. But find a neighbor, and preferably someone you don't know. I don't know how well you all know each other. But if you can find someone you don't know super well, and just take a minute each to share what does that phrase, the illusion of separation, evoke for you. And are we an even number? We're an even number, so you don't need to do a group of 3. And folks who are on Zoom, please go ahead and put some thoughts in the chat rather than do breakout groups for just a minute. If you have any thoughts, and we'll hear them in a moment. And make sure you swap and give your neighbor a turn. Okay, go ahead and wrap up your conversation, please. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Either side. Where's, oh, that's the camera. Can I stand in front of the podium, though? All right, great. All right, if you could bring your attention back here. Thank you for jumping into conversation. I'll say that when I first started this book, it was called The Illusion of Separation. And I remember someone from my Quaker meeting, Chestnut Hill meeting, said, maybe you can find a catchier title. But I'm finding that in these days, more people are understanding the language. So I'm curious what came up for you. Maybe just real quickly, what were some of the things you talked about? Anybody on this side want to start? The need for interdependence. We do have a mic. I can also just, this is going to be brief, so I'll just repeat. So, great, thank you. Anybody want to build on that? Interdependence with what or whom?
We're going to have to compromise on things like antiseptic nature of our lives, personal hygiene, everything being perfect and pure.
We're going to have to compromise on, so you're talking about interdependent, so.
Everything kind of gets dirty.
Okay. Accepting that bugs are part of our life and dirt and things like that, and that we actually need them. Okay, a few others?
I focused on the illusion. I was thinking the other day, it's too bad air isn't colored so that we could see how connected we are.
Thank you. I will say one of the chapters is from India, where the air is colored like grayish brown when it's in the bad pollution season. Go ahead.
I was thinking about how all humans are dependent on Mother Earth for sustenance, and so in that way we're one of Mother Earth, and we are also all together as humans needing the same thing from that.
Yeah, exactly. We're interdependent with other species of the earth and with each other. Both are true. Is there one more here, and then I'll go to Zoom, that expresses something different or a different level?
I went a few steps above to how we are from creations of the same source.
Yeah. Thank you. I was figuring that at the Center for Creative Contemporary Mysticism, that answer would be present. It's not always at bookstores, but sometimes people go to that level too, which is also a thread in the book. Do we want to hear a few comments from Zoom?
Our listeners on live stream has said it's similar to what Deborah shared, that really acknowledging Mother Earth, who will be the Savior of humanity.
Okay, so just to recap, again, an affirmation of our connection and dependence on Mother Earth.
Let me add one thing that might be of interest. Last night, my wife and I saw one of the movies that's nominated for this year's Academy Awards. Many of them don't hold interest for us, but there's one that follows this exact theme, and it's called Train Dreams.
Train Dreams.
And it's about a man who grew up in the Northwest without access to technology and all these things in his life's journey, and it very much highlights what you're talking about right now.
Great. I'm going to take that because these were all a great segue to what I've been really focused on in the last several years. And this journey started with a spiritual message in the Quaker tradition. Sometimes we talk about feeling like words came to us. And I was at a conference at Haverford College, and we were asked about our vision of right relationship, which is also language that talks about our interdependence with other people, with the natural world, with creation and the Creator. And the words that came to me were, because I was already doing environmental work with Earth Quaker Action Team, the message was, it's not about us saving the earth will survive whether we do or not, but the crisis of the earth is saving us from our illusion of separation. So that's why the long subtitle references that. At the time, I had just been to a protest in DC where an Indigenous leader from Canada, Chief Jackie Thomas, gave this speech where she talked about how her First Nations community was partnering with ranchers in order to stop a tar sands pipeline that was threatening their region. And she said of the pipeline company, Enbridge, she said, I really have to thank Enbridge for bringing our communities together. And she got kind of a laugh. And she said, this is the first time in my life I've seen white and Native people work together. And I had just come back from South Africa, where I heard a very similar story where white farmers and a group called the Landless Peoples Movement, who are Africans who are landless because of the ancestors of the white farmers. But they were partnering to stop Shell from fracking in the fragile Karoo Desert and working together to protect that land. And so something kind of quickened in me about, like, maybe there's this potential that these hard things can bring people together across different, dividing lines that have really kept us separate. And so the book is about my quest to kind of harvest some of those stories and learn from them as an organizer, as an activist, as a spiritual person. But the first part, I'm just going to read a little bit of something that happened pretty soon after the message, which was 2014. So if you remember, 2014 was the start of the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement after there had been a number of deaths, including Michael Brown and Ferguson. And so this experience was, as I said, just a few months after the message about the illusion of separation. I experienced the pain of feeling separate from someone I care about after a 2014 rally to prevent Philadelphia from becoming a hub for fracked gas. I attended with Matthew Armstead, a facilitator and trainer whom I worked with on another local climate campaign. While the crowd was predominantly white, the racially diverse speakers stressed the polluting fossil fuel facilities were likely to be built in low-income communities of color, where asthma rates were already tragically high. I'd heard the message about our illusion of separation only a few months earlier and mentioned to Matthew on the drive home that my favorite speech was the one where a rabbi said, "We are all one." I hated that speech. said Matthew, who is Black, queer, and uses the pronoun they. Matthew had recently spent 3 weeks supporting young activists in Ferguson, Missouri, after Darren Wilson, a white cop, shot and killed Michael Brown, an unarmed Black teenager. Brown's body was left in the street for hours, igniting national outrage at racist police violence. The cop had just been exonerated when Matthew explained, "We may all be one, but we're not exactly experiencing the world that way at the moment." So I kind of feel like that fits today too, right? I feel like we're at a moment where I feel more people acknowledging our interconnection, acknowledging that we need each other, acknowledging what Dr. King said, that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And the harm that's being done right now is not falling on people equally. And so whether you're the most vulnerable or the most complicit with the violence that's happening globally or locally, it's really easy to feel like we're not all connected, even though we believe that on this spiritual level we are, on this environmental level that we are. So part of what the book grapples with is, how do we talk about that? How do we live into a reality of interconnection when we live in such a divided world? I'll say for myself that I'm a Quaker. We have this phrase, there's that of God in everyone. And mostly I find it pretty easy to find that of God in everyone. Certainly traveling for the book and going to frontline communities, I really felt it strongly in communities I visited. I spent a disproportionate amount of time in Louisiana in the area called Cancer Alley, and really felt kinship with people. One of the women I interviewed was from a Black community that had spent years and years pressuring Shell to buy them out so they could move, because their community was just overrun by a chemical plant. And they also got Shell to do some more pollution control. And so it was a big victory. And when I drove around her neighborhood with her, including to the white side of her town where people denied there was a problem, she said, "The same air I breathe, you breathe." And I told her the story about the illusion of separation, and she said, "Well, that's why I let you take me around in your car." Because she, intrinsically understood that. So I felt that in communities I visited. I started feeling like I needed to spend more time with workers, people working for the fossil fuel industry, which is so huge in Pennsylvania as well as Louisiana. And miraculously, people started coming into my life. To me, that's part of my mysticism, is believing that there's a creative spirit in the universe that can help that sort of thing happen. So right after I said I wanted to talk to more fossil fuel workers, I was standing right outside LSU, Louisiana State University, and overheard somebody over my shoulder talk about Quakers. And let me tell you, the odds of that are low. There are 3 Quakers in the Baton Rouge meeting. And I just happened to have one of them over my shoulder talking out loud about Quakers. So of course I introduced myself, and through that connection met a guy who worked for Exxon for 30 years, who took me around on the same tour that I had been given by environmental justice leaders. So there was all this serendipity in my travel. And as I said, I could empathize with workers too. My dad worked on a Sun oil tanker after World War II, and my great-grandfathers were coal miners. So I could understand why someone would take a job in that industry. My most alienating experience, though, was visiting the Louisiana oil and gas industry meeting, because unlike the workers, these were the executives of companies like Exxon and Shell, which lied for years about climate change, which lobby so hard, and which right now are reaping the profits from this last election. A lot of fossil fuel money went into the last presidential election, and now they're just having a bonanza of tax cuts and regulation rollbacks. And knowing how much harm those kinds of things do, I just had a really hard time going to this conference with 300 oil and gas leaders. I tried to kind of blend in. I wore like my only pair of high heels and like my most business-looking dress, and kept hearing in the speeches the illusion of separation. So one example was there was a panel on deep sea drilling, and they were complaining about it's getting really hard to do deep sea drilling because there are more hurricanes, and because the sea level is rising, and because the roads you have to take to get down to where you launch are all flooding. And my sarcastic part was just like, are you kidding me? You know, you guys are one of the prime causers of all of those problems, which are the results of climate change, and not a mention of climate change. In a hotel that flooded during Hurricane Katrina. So that tension was very live in me. There was another speaker who was hailed as a great environmentalist because he liked to hunt and fish. His name was Scott Angel, and he was the person who the first Trump administration hired to roll back the already insufficient regulation on deep sea drilling. And having learned about the BP oil spill and how horrific it was, not only for the Gulf Coast. So one thing I read said that pelican eggs in northern Minnesota a year later, 85% of pelican eggs had oil from the BP spill or the chemicals that they used to sink the oil, because they didn't actually clean up all the oil. They used chemicals to sink it, a lot of it. And it took me a minute to realize, of course, the Mississippi River is one of the biggest migratory paths in the country. There was another study I read that speculated about turtles carrying BP oil to the west coast of Africa. So just this one incident was like a great example of the illusion of separation, that through the air and through the water, you know, this was spreading. And yet the folks at this conference were celebrating the rollback of regulation and complaining about what regulation and taxes there were. So I'm going to read a little part about my spiritual challenge of feeling one with this group of folks. And I just lost my page. Oh, that was the other one. Sorry. At the conference happy hour, I tried approaching a few women, but struggled to chit-chat, even though I normally love engaging strangers. I believe that on a spiritual level, we are all part of a larger whole, but it felt like a thin fish line of connection, hard to see under the hotel chandeliers. Although I had gone to hear their side of the story, I couldn't stop the running critique in my head about how delusional they were. Did my Quaker belief that there was that of God in every person mean I had to see the divinity in them? I believed it did, but I wasn't sure how to do that, given that companies like Exxon were responsible for an unfathomable amount of harm. The human death toll from climate change could easily be in the hundreds of millions. I boiled down my dilemma to a challenging theological question. How do I love my neighbor when he is killing my other neighbors? Back home, I shared my experience with the Quaker Support and Accountability Committee that meets with me regularly to help me stay in touch with Spirit's guidance for my work. One member said she could empathize with industry's feeling of victimhood, which I had pointed out with incredulity. It's true that people want to sue them, she said. It's true that people want them to pay more taxes, one of the recurring complaints at the conference. Put this way, by a woman of color who is quick to empathize with those hurt by industry, I could glimpse how executives felt beleaguered. From their worldview, they were just defending their profits, which was their obligation to their shareholders in a capitalist system. So this gets me trying to find a place to empathize with those folks and to see, is there anything they said that I could agree with? It was humbling to acknowledge ways I could relate to the Louisiana Mid-Atlantic Oil and Gas, LaMoga speakers. Not so long ago, I thought of the environment as a place to camp on vacation, rather than the air I breathe and the water I drink. Not so long ago, I was unaware that my daughter's asthma was likely caused by an oil refinery in a neighborhood only a few miles away from our home. And not so long ago, I thought that choosing the green fund for my retirement account meant that I wasn't investing in fossil fuels, when in fact I was. It was easy to believe that I wasn't part of the problem, though of course that is part of the illusion of separation. So I also, at the same time as working on the research for this book, was part of a campaign in Philadelphia with a group called Quaker Action Team. And thank you, Jean, for bringing little flyers and putting them on people's chairs about Equate's work. At the time, we had won our first campaign pressuring PNC Bank to stop financing mountaintop removal coal mining. And we were trying to get PECO, our local utility, to put more money into solar and especially to do it in ways that created local jobs and local benefit, not just cut down a bunch of trees and put up a bunch of solar, but to do it in a Green New Deal kind of way, although we started before that term got coined. And it was out of that and partnering with a group called Power Interfaith, which probably some of you have heard of, that was part of my motivation for researching and traveling to different groups. So one connection example was that after that experience with the Louisiana oil and gas folks, Equate was doing an action where we were going to go to the shareholder meeting of Exelon. Anybody know what Exelon is? A few people. It owns PECO. If you live in this area, you know PECO. And Exelon, being one of the biggest nuclear owners in the country, had consistently lobbied against solar in Pennsylvania. So they were very quietly undermining renewable energy that they wanted nuclear to be seen as like a green energy choice. And so we were going to their shareholder meeting in Delaware, and Equate's style of activism is to be spiritually grounded. We'll often have silence or something like that. We're not just Quaker, we're open to people of all backgrounds, but we definitely have like some of those Quaker practices like silent worship. But we also believe in challenging decision makers. So we might pray for you and knock on your door and ask you to do something hard at the same time. And so in this case, we had decided to interrupt this shareholder meeting to point out all the ways that they were getting in the way of energy transition. And I really felt that that experience in Louisiana and kind of grappling with afterward, like seeing the humanity in people heading big corporations doing a lot of harm, really helped me actually in speaking to the CEO. And it wasn't just me, there were several Equate members who kind of listened to our intuition about when it was our time to stand up and speak. And they gave beautiful messages about, why this company should be doing more with its tremendous resources. The message that came to me was to kind of show some compassion for this CEO and say, I understand that you think your job is just to maximize shareholder profits, and we are asking you to do something different, and that's weird, and we're interrupting, which is also weird. And so I sort of explained why we were interrupting instead of just politely waiting for like 30 seconds at the end during the Q&A time. And to the surprise of his staff and board, the CEO impromptu invited us to have a meeting with him, which he had refused to do before. So that, and combined with my experience with PNC, has really led me to believe that there's no guarantee that showing up in a spiritually grounded way will get decision makers to do what you want, but I think you have a better shot. That's kind of what I've got. We heard from PNC that it was hard for them to dismiss us because we weren't like yelling at them or anything. And in fact, we had one action in Pittsburgh where we had meeting for worship in a PNC bank that was kind of in a mini mall, and one of our members called everyone in the mall to silently contemplate what we were doing to the earth and what needed to change. At the same time, down the road, there was like a college conference happening, and they had like 32 people in some decision maker's office like chanting all day, and they like really wanted to be arrested, which is language we don't use for civil disobedience. Saying we want to be arrested is really not quite capturing the spirit of the thing. We wanted them to feel the weight of what we were there to do. But what we heard was that the folks down the street who chanted all day never did get arrested because the police know how to ignore chanting people, and so do politicians. But when our member called for this whole mini mall to pray about what we were doing to the earth, that was actually scarier to them. And then the police moved in and arrested our very small group because I think we were demonstrating spiritual power, which they didn't quite know how to evaluate. It was different than their power, but so they had to react with their power. Anyway, I've been thinking about this a lot, and how does this apply today? I'm really heartened to see people of different faiths in Philadelphia showing up together in the streets, at prayer vigils outside of ICE, doing accompanying work with immigrants. There's all kinds of things happening that I see connecting people, some of whom were connected before. It's better to organize if people know each other, or it's easier to organize, I should say. But I think we might be at a moment in history where people are pushed to get out of their silos because of what's happening in our country now. So I'm going to just share another example from the book and a few more comments, and then I'd love to have some dialogue about all of this. One of the other experiences that was really powerful for me spiritually was going to an indigenous-led struggle in Minnesota. Around here, not that many people have heard of Line 3. Curious, anyone here of Line 3? A few people, great. Have you heard of Standing Rock? Yeah. So Line 3 was very similar to Standing Rock, only it got a lot less press, and it was more spread out. In the case of Standing Rock, there was a pipeline that was coming through one indigenous reservation, and then people from all across the country came to that place. And there was a huge, huge camp, or bunch of camps that were right next to each other. In Minnesota, this pipeline went kind of diagonally across the land of 1,000 lakes. Think about Minnesota, known for its fresh water. And this pipeline was scheduled to go under 22 rivers, and I forget now how many hundreds of lakes. It was like really shocking how much water it was going near, when this type of oil is especially dangerous because it's really heavy, tar sands oil, and especially hard to clean up if there's a spill. And it went through several Ojibwe nations. And so the camps, the resistance camps, were spread out. They weren't as big as Standing Rock, but there were thousands of people who came, indigenous and non-indigenous people from across the United States, to be in support of this campaign. So I got to go out there and was there for about 10 days and had to come home, and it was right after I left that they put the pipeline under the river where I had been camping. And so on Facebook Live, I'm watching the the sheriff's department had taken millions of dollars from the Canadian company, Enbridge again, and if the police take millions of dollars from the pipeline company, that's the side they're on, right? They were using rubber bullets and tear gas and violently removing people, some of whom would, try and get in the way of construction. Some were doing spiritual ceremonies like in the Enbridge driveway, and still people were forcibly removed. So this was very distressing, and I felt moved to go back afterward, even though the pipeline was almost finished at that point. So I'll just read a little bit from that part. As the whole camp struggled to regroup, a new wave of Indigenous youth organized a prayer action at the Red Lake River over the installed pipeline. They hoped the police wouldn't interfere now that the damage was done. Most people sang prayers on floating wooden rafts that had to be pushed upstream to the site. I was one of 6 white allies or accomplices asked to stand as a safety barrier between the police and several Indigenous youth who climbed the Enbridge easement to sing and drum through the chain-link fence between the noisy work site and the river. In the long skirt I had been taught to wear for ceremonies, I prayed fiercely, holding one of 6 thin wooden shields that were covered with reflective metal, so that the police would see themselves if they looked at us. I was moved by the drumming and plaintive singing around me, and later asked what the words meant. A young Indigenous man with long, thin braids told me that when he was asked to sing a song, he consulted the Creator for guidance, and the words that came to him were a prayer for those doing the harm. They don't know any better, he said quietly. The message of interconnection was reinforced by the presence of our animal relatives at the action. An eagle flew high over the river before we began. An otter bobbed surprisingly close to the first raft, which the otter never did. You would see the otter at night really far away. And a turtle watched from a protruding rock. Of course, those are our clan animals, one Red Lake elder explained. I was not raised with a worldview that allowed for animals attending prayer protests. But as I waited between the otter and the turtle on my way to the Enbridge fence, I remembered Potawatomi author Robin Wall Kimmerer saying that those of us moving toward the green path are aided by other living beings who want to live too. I think I'll pause there, and I'm curious what questions you have, but also what reflections you have about how this relates to things happening in our country right now. I could say more about that, but I'd love to hear what's landing for you. On Zoom or in the room. Anybody want to start? Go ahead.
I really appreciate the chance to listen.
And let's use the mic so folks on.
Hi, my name's Chris Safa. Thank you so much for this program. So I had a similar experience with you when we were marching around City Hall with the blonde girl from Iceland doing the environmental protests. All the schools closed. There were thousands and thousands of people. We were yelling. I had my bullhorn. And then I looked up at City Hall. I said, I've been up there a lot. I'm a committee person, right? And the folks up there, not only can they not see us, they can't hear us. So I gave my bullhorn to my friend. My friends and I marched up and went to every city council office and asked for a sponsor to ask the city to stop spraying Agent Orange and Roundup all over the public land and the schools and the ball fields. And that got us started because, as you had said, yelling at people in full voice isn't as helpful as knock, knock, hello, we're here to ask you, we have this idea. And so that worked out well. And I'm pleased to tell you that we made the Healthy Outdoor Public Spaces law, and it hasn't been fully complied with, but this week, Mayor Parker asked Parks and Recreation to stop spraying it all over the ball fields where all the children play soccer, etc. So it's little by little pushing the rock up the hill. And I love that everybody here is involved, and it's inspirational to hear about your stories. So thank you.
Yeah. I want to respond to that, but I think I'll wait a second and get a few more voices in the room. Oop.
Hi, I'm Max. I'm thinking about a trip I took to Bali. The basic philosophy in Bali is called animism. They believe in evolution, but they believe, I think the saying is, ontology recapitulates progeny, that every human being has done the entire process of evolution. And so if you go to a doctor with neurosis, they say, oh, the squirrel in you is activated. Why does the squirrel energy alive in you now? And the reason that comes up for me is just beneath everything that you said seems to me to be the belief in capitalism. Because essentially you and the animists go down deeper and up higher around capitalism to a deeper truth. Inside of the bubble of capitalism, they can explain away the horrors that they do,
Right.
because it makes sense inside of their philosophy. And so it seems to me that the bigger solution is to kind of shake the consciousness of humanity alive so that each of us feel in touch with our connection to the wholeness, going deeper than our culture does and higher than our culture does, so that we can start having the conversation in a sensible environment to discuss things reasonably, sensibly, and compassionately.
Great, thank you. I'm going to respond to both of those together, even though they were very different comments. Because I do think we need a systemic change and a spiritual transformation both. I quote Joanna Macy, who many of you may know, a Buddhist systems thinker, who talks about this time period as the Great Turning. And she says we're moving away from something that she calls the industrial growth economy, where more is highly valued, to a life-sustaining civilization, which is more about, looking holistically. And she says that there's at least 3 types of work during that. One is stopping the harm that this current system is causing. 2 is building the new way we want to be. Because if capitalism ended today, we don't really have an alternative, really, to provide what people need. But there are people working on that. And then the third thing is a shift in consciousness. And that kind of goes along with that. And that framing really speaks to me, and I use it more than language about capitalism. Not that I disagree with you at all, and I try and pretty consistently show that putting profit over all else is just really bad for people and other species. Pretty consistently, the profit motive doesn't solve the interconnection issues. The Soviet Union was terrible for the environment too. So it's not just capitalism. There's something bigger than one economic model that is amiss. So that's what I like about Joanna Macy's language around it. Because so much needs to change, I really do think we need lots of different tactics. So I'm glad you mentioned the big protests and the shouting. Although I don't think shouting is the most consistently effective strategy, I also show up as a peacekeeper to big marches, because the big marches that are happening now, for some people, that gives them a sense of not being alone, which is actually important. I think it helps people feel like they could do something more than it actually changes the administration, to be honest. But there's still value in getting people to do something together. And sometimes you have decision makers who can be persuaded through a knock on the door, and some decision makers need you to sit down and refuse to leave their office until they listen to you, sad to say. But that's part of how we got the Inflation Reduction Act, was because young people in Sunrise Project wouldn't leave Nancy Pelosi's office, right? So I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of different styles of social change. And I'm a proponent of being bold and grounded, I guess, insistent and, inspired at the same time. But I have friends playing lots of different roles, including the spiritual role, because, as you said, I like that idea of reaching above and below. And that feels like a good segue to the flyers that are on your chairs about Equate's current campaign is taking on Vanguard, because, a $4 billion a year bank, which was PNC, was not big enough for us. We thought we'd go after, the biggest investor in fossil fuels in the world. Last I checked, it was like $11 trillion they managed, but the number changes, so I'm not sure what it is today. But Equate is trying to show up prayerfully to pressure this monstrosity and figure out how, we can build power. So one of the things we're doing is encouraging people to move their money out of Vanguard and tell us. So we're up to 58 million, which is a drop in the bucket by Vanguard standards. But it's also a way for people to kind of interact with this big system of capitalism with their values. But not just in isolation, to do it with other people and to count how much is a different way of doing that. And we have an action coming up on March 25th, I think at 11 o'clock, if you're curious. Now that I go out to Malvern to Vanguard after the experience at Line 3, I always notice the birds. I never noticed the birds flying over Vanguard before, but now I do. How about a few other questions or comments? Are there any on Zoom? No. Let me just see if there's anybody else first. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I just had a suggestion, an unwanted, unasked for advice with my friend that I met that's running your thing with you, to find out the chair of Vanguard, I believe is an Indian person. So it occurred to me, perhaps that person's a Brahmin, and how can you intersect that kind of spiritual, respectful balance with a conversation? Or is that possible? That's the kind of thing we do to kind of dismantle the people that decide things. Does he have a committee that's working on this? And that kind of structural dismantling of the thing is what I love to think about.
So, and that connects to this other thing of why direct action. Dr. King said that part of the reason to do civil disobedience is so people will come to the negotiating table with you. So far, Vanguard has refused to meet with us, with anybody. Their previous CEO was Catholic, and there's, Laudato Si, all this Catholic social teaching on the earth. But just because that's somebody's identity, I don't assume that I know what their deep experience is. And I would be especially careful of projecting on Salim Ramji, whose spiritual life I know nothing about. But I do think that if you get in a room with someone, finding what can we connect around is absolutely the way to go. So. Salim Ramji, the CEO of Vanguard, lives at Rittenhouse Square. So we have had Quaker worship in Rittenhouse Square outside his well-guarded apartment building. So, other questions or comments?
Eileen, yeah, I have a question. I sort of wonder, as I look around the world, and I think what I see is capitalism seems to be just sowing its own destruction, seeds of destruction. So, for instance, AI will soon replace a lot of human jobs. Autonomous vehicles will remove a lot of people from work that deliver all the goods and services to us. So what I don't see is anybody really explaining to me how people will support themselves, and there may be some environmental benefits from all this, but it seems rather cataclysmic to me.
Yeah, I don't have a solution to that. I feel like the data centers issue really started taking off as this book was in print. So a couple of people have asked me, is there a chapter on that? And there's none. Excuse me. I do know that one of the illusions of separation I encountered visiting different places was the illusion that we're separate from our history. And everywhere I went, I realized that the current environmental issues were often tied to the economic history of that region. And the relevance of that is I read about a number of transitions that felt cataclysmic economically. I read about like the coal industry in upstate New York and the Adirondacks before the Adirondacks became protected. And this one place that was part of like forging, did I say coal? I didn't mean coal, I meant iron. There was iron produced in the Adirondacks that was part of building the Brooklyn Bridge and, you know, all these different connections with downriver. And then when this company folded, like the entire town disappeared because there were no other jobs, right? And yet there was always a new thing that human labor was used for. So I don't know yet if this is different or not, or if, you know, people will want new kinds of services that will become a bigger service economy, right? I do think that this transition is exacerbating the inequalities that already existed, the environmental strain that already exists. It's making, it is probably making some things better, and it's also making a lot of things worse. And so part of the challenge of this time for me, when our democratic systems are failing so catastrophically, is figuring out where am I led to put my energy. You know, is it the data center? Is it the ICE center? Is it, you know, so that to me is another relevance of spiritual practice, is to figure out what is mine to do. I'm pretty sure solving AI is not mine to do, but it's a relevant question, you know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, and so having a sense of what is ours to do, I think, is really helpful. Go ahead. Can you wait for the mic?
What is your own sense of, I mean, within even transcending Quakerism, within it, your own personal, purely personal sense of spirituality or experience of that kind of informs your work?
My experience of like spirit? Yeah,
your experience of spirit, insofar as that can transcend any system, even Quakerism. You know.
Yeah.
Any?
I think that part of how I experience spirit is in direct guidance about things. I usually use the word spirit because it's gender neutral, but I'm kind of open to all the words, you know. I believe there's something. I believe there's something that put me at the right place to overhear one of 3 Quakers in Baton Rouge, or lots of other experiences I've had where serendipity helps me to do what I think I'm called to do, and also affirms when I'm on the right or sometimes the wrong path. So that's one part of it. I often feel closest to that in nature, as many people I think experience in the woods or in the natural world. And the natural world helps me, I think there's something to me about humility, but not false humility. So I was raised Roman Catholic, and there's a kind of humility. Just to take a little side note here, my mother used to always quote the Irish nun she had in school, who would say, "You were put on this earth to suffer for the glory of Christ, and the sooner you get used to it, the better off it'll be." So there's a kind of what I experience as toxic spirituality that's like, sit down, shut up, you're not that important. But there's another kind of humility, which was one of the core principles of the Ojibwe. They're part of the Anishinaabe, and there's 7 Anishinaabe teachings, including courage and kindness. I'm not going to remember them all, but humility was one, and that was very much felt in the culture. And there's something about being in a forest or seeing the night sky that just reminds us how little our lives are in the scheme of things. And so when thinking about like the future of humanity and artificial intelligence or any of those big questions, I just feel reminded that I can only see a tiny part. And I tend to share Joanna Macy's optimism or hope, maybe it's hope more, about humanity being on a journey of transformation that is going to really change how we live with each other and the earth. I'm not that hopeful I'll live to see it. But part of my belief in something bigger than myself is that I don't have to live to see it for it to be important. So. Okay. Thanks.
Two things. A lot of countries are experimenting with guaranteed income. The idea that you have to work to be paid isn't part of nature. The abundance is for all of us. So when AI or whatever are doing the scut work, the rest of us could be eating and meditating. The second thing is, in the Southern Hemisphere, there's an economic model being experimented with called the donut. The idea of the donut is that the economy is where the flour is. Inside the donut, the whole of the donut, are the things that the economy is affecting locally. And outside of the donut are the things that the economy is affecting externally. And in the countries, I think Australia is working with this, and New Zealand, in creating the laws to implement the donut, there are limits on the damage you can do outside or inside the donut, and advantages that you can foster outside and inside the donut. So rather than it just being thinking that it's everything, the economy exists in relationship, connected to what's smaller than the economy and what's larger than the economy.
Thank you. I'll say that the indigenous section of the book also has examples of what Joanna Macy calls that second kind of pillar of like building the alternatives. And partly because indigenous people who are actively reclaiming their own history say, well, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We actually knew how to live in relationship with this land. So I talk a little bit about Winona LaDuke, who is one of the leaders of the Line 3 struggle, who has now gone back to hemp farming. And because hemp apparently had like all these uses before the petrochemical economy, not just clothing, but a huge amount of clothing was made from hemp. It's very sustainable. It has all these strengths and benefits. And interestingly, it stopped being used as the fossil fuel industry wanted to be able to sell the kind of chemical waste of their facilities, which makes plastic. And so the push for plastics and God knows what all is in our clothes, you know, a lot of the time partly came from that one industrial model. So that's an example of people trying to kind of reclaim a different way of doing things. On the Navajo Nation, there was a group that got started and then started spreading this to other places. It was founded by a group of young people who were both Navajo and Hopi, which is one of the dividing lines in that region. Those two nations have been pitted against each other. So youth from those two groups got together and they were pushing to close down coal on the Navajo Nation. And they had one victory of one of the big coal plants, but they realized their people needed jobs because we are in an economy where people need jobs, unless you're independently wealthy. And the land has been taken so much and stripped so much that just living off the land by itself was not easy. So they founded this solar company that trains people in their community to install solar that provides electricity oftentimes to people who had no electricity before because they got bypassed when they were building the power lines to Las Vegas. And because it's so localized, it's not affecting habitat the way that big solar fields do. So I feel like my calling is mostly around stopping the harm, but even in doing that work, I kept running into people who were trying to build these kind of alternative ways of being, which will be even more important if AI takes everybody's other jobs. So. Anything else? What?
Just one quick one. I was interested in your thoughts on a phenomena that has occurred in the past 3 or 4 months, and it's the group of monks that began walking from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, and they would come out and say, this isn't a political action, you know, we're not advocating anything, we're just calling people to rethink how they live and to live by peace. And, you know, what are your thoughts on how that fits into the overall of what we're doing?
Yeah, I think that part of the reason direct action is powerful is because people are showing a willingness to sacrifice. And I think that's also true of things like the long walk. So, yeah, it was amazing to see how many people were really moved by the monks, including, I don't have cable at home, but when I'm traveling, like I'll like switch between Fox and CNN just out of curiosity, and everybody was like obsessed with the monks. It was fascinating. But I think their message resonated, but also the fact that they were walking in the cold, that they were sacrificing for their beliefs, enables people to hear what they're saying in a different way, is my experience. Yeah, and talking, and that reminds me of one other thing I wanted to say, kind of connecting the themes of the book to today. I obviously believe deeply in our interconnection, and I also want to go back to what my friend Matthew said at the beginning, that we may all be one, but we're not exactly experiencing the world that way at the moment. There's been regular vigils outside ICE in Philadelphia, and an attender at my meeting who went to one of them heard a white person praying for the people in ICE and was kind of like, what the hell, you know, like, why are you praying for them? And I really feel both sides of that. I feel why that would land on him that way if he doesn't hear that person also praying for the immigrants. Now, I happen to know a lot of white people who are saying, let's really pray for the people in ICE, and I know they're also showing up and doing accompaniment, and they are praying for the immigrants. But I just speaking to the white folks here, I think we need to get a little more self-aware about how we sound sometimes when we say things like that, to understand why it's important to acknowledge that all these risks are shared and unequal at the same time. Whether it's pollution or climate change or police violence or the threat to our democracy, we are all affected by them, and I'm not the most affected person. So there's something about holding two truths, which I feel like it's a great time for us to practice. And I think the monks, I'm going to speculate here, that they were able to bridge that. And if it was, yeah, and I think that we just need to be aware that that message of oneness, which I think is so important, can sound hollow if it's coming from somebody sitting on their couch, not in the street, or not showing up in ways that put that belief into practice. So I think that's my encouragement, is to find ways to carry that into our work, whatever it is. Do you mind waiting for the mic so people on Zoom can hear you?
Yes. Response to what the gentleman was talking about with the monks. Several years ago, I went to a demonstration in Washington, D.C. It was way back when they were doing the chits in Florida with the voting and everything.
Yeah.
So I attended that. We, as the groups of hordes of people marched with the drums and the signs and everything, and you know, I was a part of that and felt the energy. But we happened to walk past a nice part of grass, and on the grass was a row and rows of monks. They might have had 2 or 3 little signs, but they were sitting there in lotus style doing meditation. That was the most powerful demonstration. The drums stopped, people stopped chanting, they gave them respect. I stood there, many people stood there a long time. We felt the draw to sit with them, but I didn't have enough understanding or courage to sit with them. They were more powerful than the March on Washington, and they said nothing.
Thank you for sharing that. So I'm just going to end with the end of the book, but I'll say before I do that I have books available. And I also have my previous book, which is the story of how I started doing direct action. And I have a monthly newsletter, if you're interested in signing up for that, as well as some information on Equate. So one of the questions people often ask is about hope. And one of the people I interviewed, I don't know how many people know of Daniel Hunter, has gotten a lot better known in recent years. He was a climate activist. He did global trainings of like climate activists around the world, but then founded a group called Choose Democracy, which predicted January 6th. We did a bunch of trainings. I was part of that in 2020 for how to respond if the Trump administration didn't go quietly, if they lost the election. And then this election cycle, he revised Choose Democracy and has been doing nonviolent training around the country. So I interviewed him about what he had learned from his climate work. And then near the end of our conversation, I asked whether he felt hopeful about the state of the climate movement. And I think this applies to all the movements right now. In response, Daniel offered a story. Just the day before, he was canoeing on the Delaware River with his then 2-year-old daughter, and they capsized. I grabbed my daughter. She was all right, so we began swimming to shore, he recalled. Although they were in a harbor, the waters were very choppy. There was a moment when I worried that we wouldn't get to shore because we just weren't getting there fast enough. Fear was setting in. I felt my own chest tighten as I listened. This was how many of us felt about our journey toward what Joanna Macy calls a life-sustaining civilization. We just weren't getting there fast enough, and our children's lives were at stake. Daniel said he realized that worrying about the outcome wasn't helpful and wouldn't change his actions anyway. I heard it as a moment of letting go of fear. There's only one thing to do. I am going to swim to shore, he told himself. That was it, he said with a laugh as I wiped my eyes. So that's how I feel in terms of where we are. He added that one of the things he's learned from climate colleagues in the Global South is that they are not burdened by the mythology common in US movies and novels, where an individual hero saves the entire universe against all odds. He said it has helped him psychologically to realize that he can't carry the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. That's unfair and unrealistic. All any of us can do is keep swimming, doing our part to reach the shore. So, thanks for having me.